Thanks for joining us today at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. This session is entitled The Spiritual and Generational Urgency for a Climate Neutral and Nature Positive Planet. It's my pleasure to welcome you today. My name is Gopal Patel. I am the founder and the co-director of Bhumi Global, a Hindu environmental organization. And we're here joined by 5 excellent panelists from all corners of the world, spanning different generations and spiritual traditions, and I'll get to them shortly. But just to set the framing for the session today, we know that the UN Environment Programme frames the planetary crisis as a threefold crisis, one of climate change, one of biodiversity, and one of pollution. And as we know, all of these 3 concerns are deeply interconnected, and we cannot solve one without solving the other 2. So here we are today in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt talking about climate change. But many of us, in a few weeks' time, will be in Montreal, Canada, for the Convention on Biological Diversity, COP15, where we'll be talking about biodiversity and advocating for a strong and ambitious global biodiversity framework. So it's only right that we have come here today to have a conversation to see how we can align these 2 crises of climate change and biodiversity. How do we align action and advocacy so that we can have a climate neutral and a nature positive world? And we are having this conversation with 2 key constituencies, faith and youth. We know that faith groups over recent years have been increasingly active in global advocacy in terms of addressing climate change, and they are increasingly active in terms of advocating for biodiversity. We know they have a strong moral voice, and the faiths are bringing this to the climate and biodiversity spaces. And I myself consider myself a person of faith. The second group are the youth, and I don't think I consider myself a youth anymore as much as I would like to. But we know, as we're seeing here in COP27 and in other international forums and on the streets, youth groups are increasingly raising their voice, urging for urgent action to ensure they have a livable planet for the future. And so that's why we felt it was very important to bring these 2 groups together, faith and youth, to see how they can align in their action and their advocacy. And as I mentioned, we have 5 excellent speakers who can illuminate this subject for us. We have Alphonse Moua in the middle there from the Catholic Youth Network for Environmental Sustainability in Africa. We have Dr. Alexandra Goossens-Ishii from Sokogokai International, Andrew Schwartz from the Center for Earth Ethics, Shrishti Singh from the Indian Youth Climate Network, and Gavin Edwards, the director of the Nature Positive Initiative at WWF International. So I'm going to start with the same question to all of you, but asking that you answer it from your own individual perspectives. And so, Alphonse, I'll start with you, as you're sat there in the middle. From the African context, and also from the youth context with your youth organization, what are your members saying about the crisis of climate and biodiversity, and how are Catholics responding to that?
Thank you so much, Gopal, for that question. Well, I think the nexus between biodiversity crisis that we are having and climate change cannot be overemphasized, because the 2 are quite intertwined. We can't talk about this crisis in isolation. And we've seen a world which talks about biodiversity in biodiversity world, pollution in pollution world, climate change in climate change world, chemicals and waste in that, which I find quite unfortunate in some way, because we end up handling this crisis in a silo approach, which should not actually supposed to be that way. And now speaking from a perspective of young people from Africa, we are part of an organization that is called Catholic Youth Network for Environmental Sustainability in Africa. It's youth, faith-based, environmental organization that is present in different regions in the African continent. And my colleague David here keeps on reminding us that in Africa, most of the challenges that we have there could be similar, but not the same. at times you'll find that every region may be facing almost similar challenges, but if you go to the nitty-gritties, you find a lot of differences. And if you use the same approach in addressing these challenges in different areas, you may end up failing. And in the SAINESA perspective now, Catholic Youth Network for Environmental Sustainability in Africa, it was actually created to handle this, the trial crisis of biodiversity loss, pollution, and climate change. And as the days go by, I think these problems get worse. You know, we've seen so many years of multilateral approach to combat these issues, but as the years go by, instead of making progress, we are seeing like things getting to be worse. And that's why I always remind to quote the words of Gustav Speth, where he says that he thought with 30 years of clear science, with 30 years of working so hard to end this crisis in terms of scientific approach, things would change. But they are getting to be worse. Why? The moral fabric is getting to be shattered. We are having very great progress in terms of technological advancement, but a lot of erosion in the moral world. And that's what now it comes in to say that the greatest problems actually that are facing and contributing to environmental challenges that we have is actually apathy, selfishness, and greed, you know. And scientists don't know how to deal with this. So it's now upon us, people of faith, to come in and push for inclusion of values and ethics in how to handle these challenges. And that's what actually we are doing in SAINESA. Last year we ran a big campaign covering like 5 Catholic dioceses in the country, trying to have, to build capacity of young people in terms of this post-2020 global biodiversity framework and have them contribute, you know. And then afterwards, we were actually working hand in hand with WWF in that, the Nature Positive campaign. We rolled it up in the country of Kenya. And trying to see how best faith can impact, and faith can also bring a lot of input in terms of policy shaping in these aspects. So in just a nutshell, and for a start, because I don't want to end up talking about all these things that we are doing in the country and taking up all the time, but what we are doing in Africa is to charge young people. We have the youngest continent in the whole world. In Kenya, we have an average age of 20. In the whole of Africa is actually 19. The median age of the African person is actually 19. So that's basically, we were from a meeting now with the minister. She was saying it's basically the whole of the continent. It's everyone, you know. And if we don't use this opportunity, we don't use this potential, we don't direct it to the right direction, we'll be, failing basically. So that is what we are doing in SAINESA. And we've followed along the whole process of post-2020 from 2019, August, up to now. We were together with her and you, Gopal, in Nairobi in the previous negotiations around post-2020, trying to follow through from policy formulation down to implementation in order for us to save, halt, and reverse loss of biodiversity that we are having. Because I think there is close connection of climate, biodiversity, but also, we also say there's no blue without green. We also need to take care of our water sources. And by taking care of biodiversity, we take care of water sources and create a climate resilient future. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Alphonse. And there was an answer there to my question of wanting to be a young person again. I guess if I come to Kenya, then I can say my average age is 19, then I can be fine. But that's amazing to hear all the good work that you're doing with SAINESA in Africa and in Kenya specifically. And Shristi, I want to pass it to you. India, again, is another country with a large youth population, large economic growth in recent years. How are the youth of India, how are they talking about and addressing these concerns of climate change and biodiversity?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, sorry. So I'm not really from the biodiversity background, but my experience with youth, working with youth, and being at in the youth delegation has been great so far. But at the same time, I also feel that the biodiversity work which has been happening at the ground level by the local youth has to be part of such dialogue. So I'll be talking on behalf of the youth who have been working at the ground level, especially in the marine biodiversity area. So I was leading one of the bigger programs on a UNEP program called the Tide Turners Plastic Challenge, where we mobilized a lot of youth on taking action on plastics, which is one of the major major impacts, which is having a very cross-cutting impact with the climate change as well. So we try to mobilize the youth in terms of building their skills, giving them a lot of knowledge on plastics and all that. But what they really feel was the biggest problem in terms of them working in climate change and biodiversity, especially trying to restore the marine ecosystems and all that, was having those skills, having those right skills to sort of work with their authorities, communicate well so that they can mobilize some funding to restore their biodiversity, their beaches, and also connect with the right people so that they can bring those nature-based solutions forward. So my point here is that youth are now aware about the climate change and biodiversity dynamics, but they don't know how to move forward. And that is mostly the case when we talk about the local community youth. They are taking actions on their own. They are trying to lead. They have a lot of knowledge on how to they are organizing a lot of beach cleaning campaigns. They are trying to build bigger networks. They are trying to educate other youth. They are trying to collaborate with other youth at the local level, but they don't know how to move forward. For example, if they have cleaned a beach, they don't know how to where should they submit those plastic which they have collected, how to go to the right recycler, how to bring in partnerships with the authorities. So those are the challenges which they are facing. So that's the one side of youth from India who are taking a lot of local actions and still facing a lot of challenges. The other side is youth in the policy spaces. So while Youngo has been, great in bringing those voices at the forefront, we are still lacking in how to develop certain strategies to reach out to the national governments. And with that, how can we also bring together the local youth and their experiences to the policy spaces? So I myself have been working at the grassroots level for quite some time, and working with these youth, have been working with the urban communities as well on building their resilience capacities. And I try to translate my grassroots experience in the policy spaces, but I must say it is very difficult. It took me like 2.5 years to understand the policy dialogues and how can I rightly contribute to this whole space, because I feel really privileged to be in this space and to, being here, contributing on behalf of various networks and all that. So I think I would like to summarize in a way that the biggest challenges which we are currently facing as youth at the local level is skill development in some ways, and also when we are here in the policy spaces, how the skills could be developed so that we can contribute better and more effectively, so that we can bring those voices at the policy level as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Shrishti. And you used one word there which really caught my attention, which is restoration, or to restore. And I want to turn to Andrew Schwartz from the Center for Earth Ethics. You've been working this past year on restoration, ecosystem restoration specifically, and I know you just run from another event where you were talking about the spiritual aspects of ecosystem restoration. I'm wondering if you could speak about how restoration is a good container for understanding climate and biodiversity and the spiritual aspects of that.
No, thank you, Gopal. And yeah, just what you were saying, these are interlocking challenges, right? And I think also, as you referenced earlier, so often we silo these things. And so it constricts the conversation. It constricts the ability to imagine if you're so stuck thinking just in one pathway. And I think, Gopal, as you were saying, this container, because restoration, it draws from local communities. It draws from the need to engage with people who have more knowledge than I have. You know what you know, right? But what does somebody else know? How do I bring them into this space in this conversation? And how do we create this more holistic ecosystem of just thought and knowledge and power sharing to then apply it to a problem? And I think that's one thing, it's just absurd, right, that we talk about biodiversity in completely different context in this. It's huge. And so I think part of it is this like fragmentation of Western thinking, but then there's also this general misunderstanding of the interconnectivity of the earth, and then the social mycelium that connects all of us in all these different pieces. And so for me, restoration is an opportunity to gather all these different pieces together, to get people from their own vantage points to see the same problem and speak their own truth into it, and then finding that common ground. But you're right, like these policy pieces are so challenging. The finance pieces, it feels like 90% of this conversation is like, oh my God, how do we get money here? We're ready, please. And somebody's like, well, how do I make money off of it? And you're like, you're killing me, absolutely killing me. And so I think that's part of it, right? Like there's this here and now, and then there's the investment in the community and the knowledge and the youth. And then there's the investment in that 100 years. And I think that's where that spiritual currency is to counteract the moral bankruptcy that is so much of this moment in time. We put ethics on a sliding scale that's directly related to market conditions of, is this better or worse? Will this make me more money? Well, sure, but it's a little worse for the world. Knowing how to name things as good or bad, as right as wrong, and then helping to overlay that into the plans of how are we restoring our communities, how are we restoring our ecosystems. These are connected pieces. You can't talk about ecosystem restoration unless you talk about the colonialism, the misogyny, the racism, the sexism, pick one, that led to the conditions to create the massive destruction that we're experiencing. And so for me, restoration, for this project that we did with the UN Decade, we talked to communities around the world. And they basically, as you were saying, Alphonse, they all have the same story, more or less. Some jerks came in, they stole all of our stuff, they oppressed us, they divided us, and now we're left with all these wounds to the land and to ourselves and to our bodies, to our souls. And so part of the work of ecosystem restoration is like, what stories can we tell collectively? What wounds do we need to heal internally? And then how do we come together as a community to foster the sort of conditions we need on the ground? And so for me, this conference, this moment, the CBD, as long as we're so convinced and insistent on what's next. Most of the conversations here have been about COP28, which is shocking. Sometimes you need to slow down if you want to speed up. And I feel like that's what a lot of ecosystem biodiversity work is slowing down, is being with each other, being with the land, learning to grow and nurture in a different way, insisting on better, insisting on community. And from there, we have an opportunity to grow. And so, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Andrew, for that. And one key aspect of that through the work you've done this year is the importance of human rights and a rights-based approach when it comes to the protection of biodiversity. So, Alexandra, I'm wondering if I can turn to you and if you could speak a little bit about what is happening, what is giving you hope when it comes to human rights in the context of climate change and biodiversity.
Thank you very much. So thanks very much for everything that you shared, Andrew, that you both shared as well. It's very inspiring. From I would say, yeah, my background, my grounding is in human rights. I feel deeply as a hook to create and change the narrative towards a narrative of really respecting the dignity of people and the integration of people and nature as like this narrative of really co-flourishing. And so there are two things that I think are really hopeful if we take them as hooks that are actually outside of this space. It's coming from the space of human rights, but I think it's starting to really have an impact, and it shows that some narratives deep down are changing. And so the first one is that in the human rights context, there was the appointment of a new special rapporteur to the UN on human rights and climate change. So actually that has been a fight for many years to get that. And actually the first groups that called for that and really said that that was needed more than a decade ago were faith groups. And so they were the ones to really call. At that time, they were really laughed at because they was like, this is not feasible. This is like ideal, but it's not feasible. And so 10 years later, we have the first special rapporteur on human rights climate change, who we really hope will be one of the bridge as well between the different spaces. Another point I think is really a great development is that for this year, also after many, many years of fight, the UN resolution recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment was adopted at the General Assembly with more than 163 countries voting in favor. And there were lots of ups and downs in that campaign. And at some point, we actually didn't think it would be. We were a bit scared on the way, but like that was a wave, a massive wave where, of course, there are many challenges afterwards, and we're not talking about implementation yet. But still, in terms of like this narrative change, I felt that there was a current that is moving forward. That gave me hope. Now, translating that into these spaces here, I would say I'm really, both here in UNFCCC and in the CBD process, I am fighting and advocating for really everything that relates to participation. So rights-based approaches in relation, especially, but not only, to really the right to participate, the right to access information, and in the context of indigenous peoples, but the free, prior, informed consent. And we were discussing with other faith colleagues as well, like, why is this actually important? But this is important because if policies are seen as unfair, if they are not like discussed together, communicated, ultimately there is a big backlash. And one example that was given when we were discussing was in France. There was the carbon tax that was hoped to be introduced by the government, but that was seen as really unfair because it was taxing the people and not the companies at source. And so it led to the Gilets jaunes movement, so big social backlash as well. So participation ultimately is, and then really the respect of for human rights and rights-based approach ultimately is also to enable more efficient action on ultimately, so that we can really also be seen as moving forward together in a way where we are understood, in the way where you were describing in terms of ecosystem approaches. And so these are things that we are, as faith groups as well, are advocating for here and going to keep advocating for in the CBD negotiation. And I think advocating because ultimately I think that it's important to keep adding every effort to establish a narrative to help changing the current of the water and help changing the narrative so that this becomes not possible to go back on. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Alex. And Gavin, I'm wondering if I can turn to you there to help us pivot a little bit towards COP15 and the CBD. what is the connection? Explain to us what is the connection between climate and biodiversity, and explain to us the importance of the global biodiversity framework, which will hopefully be agreed upon in Montreal next month.
Great, thanks Gopal, and thanks for the comments so far in the discussion. Maybe I can pivot back to some of that as well. First of all, climate and nature. We've heard two sides of the same coin. You can't have action on one without action on the other. Let me just throw out a couple of numbers to you. All of the CO2 that we've been putting up in the atmosphere over the last decades, about half of it has been absorbed by nature. Nature has been taking it in, sometimes with devastating effects. Ocean acidification, which is basically harming our coral reefs around the world, is a major challenge. But nevertheless, nature has essentially been our secret ally, making the worst impacts of climate change, blunting those impacts. But because we've been taking nature for granted, it can no longer keep doing that. It's getting to its limits to be able to sequester carbon. And so that is bad for climate. The more we denude the biosphere, the more we lose nature, the less it can help us on the fight on climate change, to mitigate climate change. And then, of course, we all know the examples of nature helping us adapt to climate change as well. Mangroves, healthy mangroves will help against storm surges and sea level rises, and many other examples as well. So we've been taking nature for granted. Lastly, the climate models on which we depend to guess where the temperature is going are all assumed that we will have a stable biosphere in nature. But we don't have stability in nature. We are losing nature. So some of those models for what kind of a temperature rise, 7 degrees, 2.8 degrees, will be wrong. They may be too conservative unless we get on top of nature. So that's why a nature agenda is absolutely essential to a climate agenda. Nature, of course, is important in its own right. We can't keep picking apart the web of life and expecting at the same time nature to provide all those amazing services that we have. Food for 8 billion people, food waste on top of those 8 billion as well, which we need to stop. Clean water, healthy environment, the right to a healthy environment, of course, absolutely essential. And nature has to provide that, but can't keep on providing that if we keep undermining it as well. So clearly something has to change in this dynamic. What I've noticed after coming to many climate COPs and working on nature is that we've made a bit more progress on the energy side of climate. Nowhere near enough, but some on renewable energy efficiency. Nowhere near enough progress on nature. It's going very, very slowly. So we need to re-energize that. There are a couple of ways to do that. One is it's great to be at a climate COP talking about nature. It's great to be on a panel with non-conservation specialists talking about nature. So that is incredible progress as well from where we were a few years ago. But as well as this, we also need an agreement on nature, and that is, as we heard earlier, the Convention on Biological Diversity. It will put together its 10-year action plan in this December in Montreal. That action plan, we feel, should be nature positive. It should have a mission to not only stop the loss of nature, but to reverse and restore nature. The idea of nature positive being that there should be more nature in the world in the 2030 than there was in 2020. And the whole number of steps need to be behind that as well. We need to protect larger spaces. We need to work with rights-based approaches with communities to do that. We need restoration approaches that are community-led. And a very different approach to agriculture and agroecology, not undermine nature and continues to put too much carbon up in the air as well. So if we can get this right in Montreal, if we can get momentum on good nature-based solutions, not nature-based problems, some of the solutions are not thought out, but good nature-based solutions, we can see that momentum that we've been missing, which is going to help us get on a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway, help us with a nature-positive world, and also help us secure those basic human needs that we all depend on, and without which we are going to be in so much trouble. We're not going to meet the Sustainable Development Goals without some serious action on nature. Perhaps my last reflection from what we've seen and heard so far, this is complicated stuff. There's a lot of dots to join when we link agendas. The agendas don't work in silos, and when you link them together, it becomes a very big jigsaw puzzle. So I think what I encourage everyone to do is find out how you can get involved. You know, it can start with a beach cleanup and working on plastics and having that light bulb moment, and it can move on from there to helping greener business. But ultimately, we need that policy direction as well. We need to know where we need to go. Where we need to go on climate, a 1.5 degrees Celsius world. We need to know where we need to go on nature and a positive world. And then we can all contribute from wherever we are in this wonderful ecosystem of actors and players to be able to get there as well. So hopefully that reflection helps the discussion. Thanks, Gopal.
Thanks, that was loud. Thanks, thanks, Gavin. And I'm wondering, Alphonse, if I can turn to you to pick up something that Gavin said there, is that this work is complicated, and a lot of this work is about connecting the dots between climate and biodiversity, human rights, and so many other concerns. What have you seen in Sinesa that's worked in terms of mobilizing your members to get them engaged on climate and then engaged on biodiversity? What success stories can you point to about aligning the gaps between the two?
Thank you so much. I think from the presentations made, from the presentations made here by every panelist, it's quite clear. I mean, we have to deal with these challenges in a very unified approach. And that also sends me to recall some excerpts of encyclical advocacy that was released by Pope Francis in 2015, where he starts the encyclical by trying to open our eyes on what's happening to our common home and talking prominently on loss of biodiversity, and then goes down to also expose some of injustices around there, how some communities are being taken through, I mean, a lot of biodiversity resources are extracted, and then all the profit is taken into another world altogether. So I think how answering a question on how this in Sinesa, more specifically we are dealing with young people to ensure that there is clear connection on this, is that one, we are ensuring that young people are made aware. There is capacity development in terms of information. I think most of the people think young people only need financial resources to get around their problems. And I don't think that's right. That's not true, by the way. Most of them just need the requisite information, and then after that, they can go around, they can know where resources are, they can know how to access the resources and all those things. Then another thing that is there is we need also, we in Sinesa also ensure that we train young people to engage with policy spaces. And that's why you can see we have a number of members from Sinesa here in this conference. We follow through climate convention. We follow through discussions around UNCBD as well as UNCCD, and a lot of negotiations that happen at the UNEP level. Another thing is that we ensure that these young people that are empowered, they have information, they are exposed to interact with policy formulation processes. They are also working on the ground to transform realities. Because we may have everything fantastic on paper, like now we have. All the requisite science is available. We've developed so amazing policies. But if you go to the reality, you don't see that. You know, it's not reflected. And that's what actually makes difference. So in Sinesa, we are also ensuring that we promote participation of young people in implementation of these actions on the ground. And in that, I can also speak to something that is currently happening in Kenya with the current administration that we have, with a very ambitious goal of planting like 15 billion trees thereabout in 10 years within this decade. By 2030, there's a goal to grow forestry cover from 10% where we are right now to about 30%, which is a very ambitious target. But for it to be implemented, we again need public spaces. We need faith-based actors to implement this. And in Sinesa, we are leading that. You'll find that religious areas have biggest lands available. They have, they command big masses of people. So if this information is broken down to the people from that level of pulpit, then we can have a lot of change that we want to have. So in Sinesa, we're also working with the clergy, with laity, with young people, to ensure that this information gets down to the people from these different levels, from institutions, learning institutions, from church centers, also working with interfaith actors, but also working with scientific institutions. Right now, we are just exploring, possibilities of working with Stockholm Environment Institute, Africa Regional Office based in Nairobi, to ensure that we have access to the best scientific information available, and ensure that young people also have access to this. And that's how we are going to change things gradually. I think also, quoting Pope Francis' encyclical, he says that young people demand change. They wonder how anyone can be thinking of a better future when they are not taking into account young people and the problems of the excluded people. So I think if this change has to happen, if we have to ensure that we get to have huge base of carbon sink, we need to preserve nature. We need to restore the nature that we've already lost. And in Sinesa, I think we are in the front line working with the communities, living the realities of climate change, to implement this and to ensure that they are also empowered, because right now we have a lot of hopelessness. We have a generation of young people which is filled with cynicism, with anxiety. How do we transform this into progressive action on the ground? And I think we are right on track. We just want to ensure that we come together, work together, empower these young people with information, with funds, with everything that they need for them to scale up, because they are already doing their part. Leaders are not doing enough. So we still have a long way to go. Thank you.
Alex, did you want to comment on that? Okay. Thanks, Alphonse. And Shrishti, I want to give it to you, because Alphonse is talking about the members of his organization, Young Catholics in Africa. But obviously, Indian Youth Climate Network is a secular organization. So what about young people who maybe don't belong to a religious tradition? And Alphonse is saying that a lot of young people globally are feeling burnout, feeling anxiety, are concerned about the future. We're talking about bridging gaps here, climate and biodiversity, but also between faith and youth groups. From your vantage point of a young person living in India, but also working in global forums, how do you think young people who necessarily don't belong to a faith tradition, how can they work with faith groups, or how could faith groups work with those young people? I'm wondering if you can speak to that.
Thank you so much again. So I'll pick up on 2 points which my previous speakers just mentioned. So one is about, I think, participation in such dialogues. People might not know you if you are working very remotely and have been contributing your best, but if you are if you are participating in various dialogues in local conferences of youth, which is one of the younger projects, so you get to know people. And when you get to know people, you are part of those networks, you are part of those information channels, you participate in various surveys, you read certain reports, so that really creates those kind of partnerships which we currently need. So when I also talk about participation, youth who need those kind of spaces to participate also need a lot of education. So following ACE dialogues, ACE Action for Climate Empowerment negotiations for the past 2-3 years, I have been personally looking at how youth have been playing a major role in you know uh, pushing the ACE dialogue forward, because they now realize that a lot of climate change education is required, not only to be in those policy spaces and contribute to those kind of negotiations, but also at the ground level, where certain youth are not even aware what kind of climate risk they are going to face. And then the climate change education becomes very important, because when there is an extreme event, there are youth who are responsible or they are taking lead in rebuilding, restoring, rehabilitating people. So there is somewhat a very strong linkage between how youth climate change education can also play a role in building resilience. So I mean, we have to work across various levels in getting them to participate in such, climate education activities, and also build their skills in a way that they are able to build resilience when an extreme event comes. So that kind of participation is really important, and slowly, they move up the ladder, and they come and contribute towards the policy spaces as well. And then we need to focus on the bottom-up approaches of doing that. The second point is about combining the education with the networks. So there, I feel the faith-based organizations are very much already there. Like if they are the youth are part of those networks and they are building those collaborations, I think we are gonna do a great job. I was the one of the co-leads of organizing the local conference of youth, and we did with Brahma Kumari's youth wing. And there was one other organization as well, but we all worked together and also learned a lot about Brahma Kumaris and how they are working, and we were using their venue to organize those conferences. So I think those kind of collaborations are also necessary on the ground, and we need to learn from each other and see. And I mean, we should not be going with certain perceptions, but should be open to seeing what other youth are doing out of other networks as well, and maybe create bigger networks and trying to find some solutions, especially the nature-based solutions as well. So that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Shrishti. And Alex, that tees it up nicely for the question I wanted to ask you. I know that you've been working on a policy document a multi-faith policy document for the Global Biodiversity Framework, and part of that is showing how faiths are aligned with other key constituencies within the CBD. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about what the multi-faith priorities are for the GBF coming up next month.
Thank you very much. Yes, so we've been working on this. The multi-faith work has been engaged already for a few years now. And so now that we're approaching COP15, we've been really working on the priorities in terms of advocacy for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And so one thing for sure is that the faith group is composed of just so many people who are part of all the other caucuses, so the NGOs, youth, women, actually also indigenous peoples and local communities are very intrinsically related to faith and spirituality groups as well. So one thing is that in many cases, we are really uplifting, amplifying, and aligning with the calls from other caucuses. So for instance, for the Youth Caucus, there is a priority call on getting transformative education in the text and also intergenerational equality. So we really support these points. The Women Caucus is advocating, and it's on good shape for now to have a gender target. So we are really supporting that. From the faith perspective as well, the first point is about the vision, so that within the text we can really feel that interconnectedness, that vision of the web of life that Gavin you were also describing, so that can be really centered on the text, and that the vision and the mission of the GBF can reflect that. Of course, we're supporting an ambitious agreement. So that the two things that we discussed, know that it both sets as the vision and the mission to halt biodiversity loss, but also to restore biodiversity. So ambition is very important, and also ambition in the implementation mechanism, so that the targets that will be associated be really strong, against which we can assess progress, and that the implementation mechanism that relates to all the national plans can also be a mechanism that allows for accountability for measuring progress. And then I think we have identified 2 more points. So the point that I was discussing earlier, it's the rights-based approach. So we're truly supporting that rights-based approach is mentioned in the right places in that biodiversity framework, so that we can then, one of the things that I was inspired by was when I heard that the Aichi targets, which are the predecessor of the GBF, none of them were achieved, no? And one of the things was rights-based approach were not in that. In a way, it was really people and nature were disconnected to. So that it can be used as a way to move forward truly. So like the rights to participation, where it should be in the targets, and the free, prior, and informed consent, really key, where it should be. And truly not just a token, but like genuine. So with the right indicators to measure that as well. And maybe the last priority that we did identify is relating to the economic system, so production and extraction. So there are targets and moments in that policy vision and document where we hope that it will really help to incentivize just transition. And the target that relates to business, I was also very inspired to hear. Currently, we feel it's not framed as a way where governments regulates. It's left as a way where businesses would self-regulate. But I was very impressed to hear that actually the coalition of businesses that was at the CBD themselves were asking for governments to adopt a much stronger vision on it, and to ask governments to regulate businesses, so that it can also move towards, as Gavin was describing, nature positive world and living in harmony with nature. So I think that that would sum up for now, but look forward to our policy documents that will be released and shared. Thank you.
And Gavin, I'm wondering if you could speak to why is it important that faith groups and other groups like youth and gender and indigenous peoples and local communities, why is it important that we advocate, and what is particularly special about the faith perspective? Because it's a relatively newcomer to the biodiversity space, and WWF have been a great supporter of that work. Why is it important, do you think, for faith groups to be showing up in the biodiversity spaces?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think it's really important to broaden out the amount of support that is going to be needed to succeed on climate and on nature. We've seen the faith community really step up in the climate space. The encyclical from the Pope was a really good example of articulating the need for faith engagement as well. And that hasn't been as common in the nature space. And I feel one of the accelerators of action in the climate space has been that voice. And so the more kind of society that we have, the more different voices that we have, the more we're likely to succeed. These are no longer be seen as niche, nice-to-have issues, climate and nature. They're fundamental. It has to be represented in who is trying to tackle it and who's providing the leadership to tackle it as well. That's fundamentally important. And then perhaps lastly, in order to implement what will come out of Montreal, which will hopefully all of those key ingredients that Alex mentioned, we'll also have a spatial conservation targets, 30 by 30, with rights-based approaches. We'll have a rest target. We'll have agroecology approaches in it. That is going to have to be implemented with the leadership of governments, with the funding by governments as well, which is often lacking, with the private sector, with a change in the financial system, which the financial system is starting to work on. But it's also going to need to be implemented across society as well. So the more touch points we all have with the wider society, the better. And the faith community, of course, is massive, massive, massive in this regard, in terms of constituencies and who faith leaders reach out to and can inspire within their own constituencies as well. So these agreements, whether it's in Sharm el-Sheikh here now or whether it's in Montreal, they're not just here agreements, they're things to be implemented throughout each and every year. And the more we have from the whole of society, the better. And that requires the diversity of voices to not only how do I implement this, but how do I help shape it as well and own it so I can help implement it. So that's why I think the faith voice is really welcome and really important.
Thank you, Gavin. I think we still have a few more minutes before we wrap up. I'm just wondering, any questions from the floor? Lady here.
Thank you so much. My name is Teresia Gitao. I am a faith-based environment reporter and also a member of SINASA. And I have two questions, which look like three questions. And the first one is, I'd like to direct it to you as WWF. So I'm just wondering, how can you leverage the local and the faith-based media to help the community? Because I've heard more about the transformative talks, transformative education. So I'm wondering, what can you do at a large scale, and especially with the local media stations in the marginalized communities, to ensure that more people get to hear this information about climate change and also biodiversity? Then the second thing would be, these are direct to everyone, and I'm wondering, as a Christian, there is a quote in the Bible that says, what the right hand does in terms of good deeds, the left hand should not know. So you find that as what the faith-based organizations are doing, it is not known, and that is simply because of the belief that what good we are doing should not be known. And I'm speaking in the aspect of the African society. Then the final question, I'd like to direct it to you, Mr. Oh, yes. And the question is, how do we slow down to speed up the restoration process? And this is after the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, because there's that element of desperation and people are wondering, the economic times are harder. So they are wondering, what do we do? So how do we slow down to speed up? Thank you so much.
Yeah, because she said WWF, so I was a little confused. Yeah, the local media actually, again, I can give you an example of how we have been engaging as youth in the local media, although it's not very often that the local media picks up those stories. But having a bit of collaboration with the local media in terms of, covering certain events. I mean, we generally invite them to cover certain events for us. And there were certain tight turner champions who actually collaborate with the local media so that they can push the authorities to, improve in the mechanisms they had put in place to for the plastics bit which I talked about. So I think there also collaborations on how this could be taken forward so that more such news could inform the local media, and the local media could then be a tool to bring in more youth together to take such actions. So that is how I myself have not collaborated with them, but the young people who I have been working with in terms of where they have been organizing local campaigns with the media, with the local authorities, and bringing in different schools together to mobilize work on plastic issues and other environmental issues. They have been successful in doing that, and they have been trying to put their stories in the local media so that it and using it as an advocacy tool as well. So yeah, that would be my submission to your question. Thank you.
I can take a stab at the third question, if you like, on restoration and how do we find the capacity to do restoration slow, fast. I think the more momentum we get on climate and nature, the more we're going to find ways to unlock new kinds of capacity and resources. And it doesn't take huge amount of resources, but some. For example, the Canadian government last year committed that 20% of their overseas development assistance on climate is going to go to nature and nature-based solutions. The French and the UK governments said 30% of theirs will. And I know different organizations around the world are trying to figure out how to unlock this to do agroecology, where you're locking in more soil carbon, helping those ecosystem services. So perhaps hopefully there should be some international funding that can be available. And on top of that, the business models of companies need to change and are starting to change as well. So I don't think we should only see helping the environment as something that is needed through charity or through overseas help and aid, but through companies working and investing differently in their business operations as well. So I think there are going to be opportunities to do restoration there. We'd like to see them scale up as of yesterday. It's slower, of course, but I do feel that the next decade is going to be different in terms of the funding that is flowing either directly or indirectly into some of this to start building that restoration agenda.
I know we're short on time. So I think when you ask that question, I think about two ways. I don't know if anybody's here ever had a panic attack. Anybody panic attacks? Yeah, they're awful. And there's a point you get in a panic attack where you realize that you just need to breathe. And I think coming out of COVID, being in this space, there's this perpetuation of almost like insanity. It feels like a panic attack where you just got to do more and more. And it feels so urgent. And that just perpetuates this feeling of anxiety and worse and worse and worse. But then when you have that moment to breathe and to look and to see and understand where you are and who you're with and what you can do, then there's opportunities to act. A second way is thinking about, we were talking about this earlier, just around tree planting versus tree growing. There's so many programs right now that are planting millions of trees. Some of them, you have drones shooting seeds into the ground. But so many of them die because we think that this is a numbers game. That we just think if we do enough and we do more, if we just plant, they'll happen. 90% of these projects, or at least in tree planting, often fail. But when you sit there and you nurture something, you're with it. You form relationship. You think about it differently. You engage your full self into it. It's slower, but then it has the opportunity to grow differently. And so that slow start can lead to a much more progressive future. Because if we keep on trying to do these same things over and over again, we're going to get the same results, right? And so for me, especially in this time, in this way, with these people in these spaces, is how do you create a moment of understanding and clarity and calm so you can think, act, and move. And so for me, especially after the pandemic, when everything is so frenetic and so crazy, and we're trying to fit so much into so little time, sometimes you just got to breathe. You got to slow down. And then from there, you can make some moves.
Great. I think that's the perfect note to end it on, and we are at time. I would again like to thank all of our speakers, Gavin Edwards from WWF International, Shristi Singh from the Indian Youth Climate Network, Alphonse Muir from Sinesa, Alexandra Gusens-Ishi from Soko Gakkai International, Andrew Schwartz from the Center for Earth Ethics. I'm Gopal Patel from Bhumi Global. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to continuing this conversation in these spaces and at COP15 next month in Montreal. Thank you.